So today is the day. Today is going to be our lesson on Eloquent ORM, connecting Slim to Eloquent and getting a database set up. Okay, so to start off with, I'm going to start installing my MySQL connection, my MySQL database using Laravel Homestead. If you want to, you can follow along. You will need VirtualBox and the Vagrant machine on your local host. We have a tutorial on that on our channel. Otherwise, feel free to connect through MySQL in any other way that you're used to doing. It can be Docker, it can be WAMP, it could be MAMP, it could be, hopefully it's Docker, not MAMP or WAMP, or, maybe something like Homestead where it's a virtual machine. But I'm going to use Homestead because it's the easiest to track on here. You do need virtual machine and you do need the Vagrant box installations. Again, we have a video on that. Okay, so the first thing, composer require Laravel /homestead --dev. That's how I'm going to install my virtual machine. While that's installing though, let's go to our bootstrap and let's go to, let's create a new bootstrapper, and we're going to call this load aliases. Now for loading aliases, we want to extend the bootstrapper class just like that, and then we'll simply copy one of these guys right over here. And we're going to say import that, except we don't really need any of that. I'm just trying to copy that function. Okay. Now what we can do is this. We want to add aliases because we're importing things from a lot of different packages. So for example, I want to get our aliases and we'll add those to config app aliases. Just like our providers are registered in our config app providers array, now we're going to add a aliases array. Specifically, the alias I want to add is for this database manager capsule thing. It's how we're going to connect Eloquent, but I really hate the name on this thing. So that is why we're adding aliases. It's because I can't stand this Illuminates Database capsule manager. It's setting up a database connection. The connection can vary. So it's fancy, it doesn't have to be the same connection, but at the end of the day, it is our database connection, and it can manage multiple database connections. That's about sums it up. Okay, so in our aliases, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go back to our load aliases, and we're going to say for each aliases as alias, the alias points at the class. We're going to say class alias points at alias, and then auto load is going to be true. Or if we want to clean that up a little bit, you can say aliases, we say function, the value is going to be the path, and then the key is going to be the alias, and then we're going to say class alias path alias and true. So one's the class path, that's our value. The other one's the alias, that's our key. So db equals /illuminate /support or database /capsule /manager class. So db is our alias, this is our alias, and then this is going to be our path. And so the array of aliases has a list of paths and then a list of aliases that reference those given paths. For each one of those, we're going to take the path and pass it as the first parameter. So this gets passed here. We're going to pass the alias as the second parameter, and we're going to hard code auto load as true within our third parameter. Finally, when that is complete, we're going to go back to our HTTP kernel, and right after we add the load debugging page, we're going to use our bootstrappers /load aliases class. All right. So after that, Yeah, I think that looks good. We're going to go back to our config/app.php, and we're going to add a new service provider. This is going to be our database service provider class. Just like that. Then we're going to go to our app providers. We're going to create a new PHP class. We're going to call this database service provider. We're going to go to the top of the file, extend service provider, add our two required public function register and public function boot methods. Then we're going to use our alias that we just bootstrapped into our application, and we're going to say use DB. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our config, and we're going to add a new config option. We're going to call this database.php. So database, since we're using Laravel's Eloquent ORM, we're going to basically copy Laravel's config that they usually use. The first option is going to be default. What is the default connection we want to use? Well, MySQL is pretty obvious there. Next, we're going to list off several connections. So what's really cool about Eloquent, outside of the fact that it's amazing to work with, is that you can actually connect to multiple database instances and multiple types of database connections at the same time. You have a default, so you can just say like db get, but for all these other connections, you can actually do db connect, and then maybe you want to connect your MongoDB instance and get from there. You know, maybe you want to connect to your SQLite instance and get from there, and maybe you just want to use your MySQL, so you don't say anything about getting. You just get your MySQL because it's your default. Your default doesn't require this connect option. Whenever you connect to a specific database, it'll look in this connections associative array. So here's how this is going to look. We're going to add two connection types. We're going to add SQLite and MySQL. Just like that. So SQLite, the driver is obviously going to be SQLite. The URL will be defined in the database URL, but it does not default to a database URL. So this will be false or not work. It will actually throw an exception if we try to get SQLite or connect to our SQLite instance without defining a database URL within our .env. Next, within our database, we actually have something right here that's very important. We're referencing a global helper that we don't have, database path. So not in this tutorial, but our next tutorial, we are actually going to set up the ability to add seeders, factories, and migrations. Actually, migrations will probably be the first one we add. Migrations, then seeders, then factory. And it looks like I already created this behind the scenes. So there's just going to be 3 directories: migrations, seeders, and factories. And again, in our next tutorial, we will really get down and dirty and figure out how to do that and set all that stuff up. But in this tutorial, we're just going to get Eloquent working. And then to get this env or config working, we need to add this database path global helper function. So we're going to go up here and we're going to simply say this. We're going to copy this current config, and we'll just knock that config down there. We're going to say, okay, let's replace config path with database path, config path with database path, and then instead of going to the config directory after we get our base path, we're going to go to our database directory after we go to our base path. Now we have a global database helper, database path helper function, and so this works. The rest of these are pretty straightforward, or they have a default if they're not straightforward. The biggest thing is these right here: database host, database port, database, database username, database password. We're going to want to define all of these in our .env, and most of them should be defined already. Okay, host, got it. port, got it, database, got it, username, got it, password, got it. So yeah, those are all defined already. When you need to connect your database, you might run into some problems trying to get this thing set up, you know, and that's a hard one because there's nothing I can do to reach out to you guys whenever you're dealing with your individual environments. It's one of the most frustrating things in software. But if you do run into problems, keep in mind that you're going to have two types of problems. One is going to be configuration. You're configuring this wrong. You're configuring Eloquent wrong. If that is the case, then you won't get the same type of database errors as you will with like configuring database MySQL wrong altogether. Configuring your database wrong altogether will not give you the same type of errors that configuring Eloquent will give you. Eloquent's errors or exceptions will be specific in saying, you know, hey, can't connect to, you know, like a specific table, whereas MySQL will be more of can't connect at all. I can't connect, I can't find this host, I don't have access. So just keep that in mind. Eloquent will be more general. MySQL errors will be very, very specific. They'll be like can't connect. Eloquent errors will be decently specific, but because it's an abstraction, it is definitely not as like, hey, I just can't connect. MySQL is a lot more straightforward with error catching and figuring out which way to go. So if you do fall into problems, just consider the errors and ask yourself, is it an Eloquent ORM thing? Is it an abstraction around the database throwing the error? Or is it connecting to the database itself? And if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to me in the comments. Okay, so now we have our vendor installed, or our Homestead installed. I'm going to say Homestead make. Now when I make my Homestead, I'm going to go to homestead.yaml. And by the way, this config stuff right here, the database, that is in the GitHub repository linked in the description. Sorry, I should have told you guys that a bit sooner. Okay, so now I got my Homestead and I just published it. So that was the first thing we did, was we required Laravel Homestead. Now I published it using /vendor/bin/homestead make. Now I need to do two things. I need to name my site slim.auth. That's what I'm going to name it. I need to point this current directory, users, zhor, and tutorials authorized slim4, to the same repository on my virtual machine. So we're using a virtual machine, so you don't have to install the right version of MySQL locally. You don't have to install the right version of PHP locally, the right version of NPM locally. By using a virtual machine, a virtual box, whether it be Vagrant, whether it be Docker, whether it be WAMP, or I hope it's not WAMP or MAMP, but whether it be any type of virtual machine, the reason you do use a virtual machine is so you don't have to manage or install everything locally and try to keep your OS in line with the application needs. You should never ever do that. You should always have a virtual machine. So this is my local machine path to the repository. All we're doing is we're taking this repository, this code right here, and we're just mounting it to my virtual machine at this path. So home vagrant code will be the exact same directory as authorized-slim-4 as this directory right here. The only difference will be on my virtual server, where we mount it at vagrant/code, I'll have all the proper PHP versions, all the proper MySQL versions, easier access to things, and all that good stuff. The last thing I need to do is I need to change my database name. I'm going to change it to Slim, because that's what I said I was going to reference in my .env. By default, Homestead will use Homestead as the username and secret as the password. So good to go there. And then I can do vagrant up -provision. So what this is going to do, this is going to boot my virtual machine, provisioning the prior settings, or changing/mutating the prior settings based on what I did to my homestead.yaml. If I don't run provision, it will just ignore any updates I made. If I run --provision vagrant up --provision, it will look for changes and then apply them. So we'll add that. Now the last thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to open this hosts directory or file, sublime/etc/hosts. This is going to be our DNS, our local DNS. We need to grab this IP address and figure out which domain we mapped, in this case SlimAuth, to the code public, the vagrant code public directory, which is actually the authorized slim4 public index directory. Remember, home vagrant code is the same thing as Zhorn tutorials authorized slim4. This is authorized slim4, code's the same thing. So we need to add the DNS settings. So to do that, I'll pull this up right here. And I do already have these settings pulled up. And normally what you do is you go right here. You'd say, okay, that's my IP address. Where did I find my IP? Well, I found my IP right here in homestead.em. It was at the top of the file. Where did I find my site? Well, it's going to be down here. It's in the sites. We're mapping to this domain. We're mapping this directory to this domain. When somebody hits that domain, this is where their request will be sent. And so, because we have our IP and we have our domain, I can properly set up my DNS. And so I'm going to point this IP address against this slim.auth domain. So when somebody visits this domain, they hit that IP address. So assuming everything worked properly, we should be able to go to http://slim.auth/api.example. And if our virtual machine is up and going, which it looks like it's finalizing. Oh no, stuck on that screen. Alright, and it looks like it is. And so slim.auth API/example. So that did work. So we're able to go to the slim.auth API. And then that should mean that we can also do vagrant SSH. We're going to SSH into our virtual machine. And then what we're going to want to do is okay, so what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to connect to our database here. If you have phpMyAdmin, feel free to use it. I'm not using it because I don't have it. So what I want to do is, first off, I want to show you guys, this is the same directory as authorized slim4. We're in our code directory right now. If I'm over here and I try to use MySQL, command not found. But because I'm in a virtual machine that is set up to handle it, I can use MySQL. That's the purpose of a virtual machine. Also notice if we show our databases, and again I'm in the MySQL terminal now, I have a Slim database. So I'm going to use that Slim database. Next I'm going to create a table called users. It's going to have an ID, which is an integer, a first name, which will be a varchar with a maximum of 255 characters, last name with a varchar of 255 characters max, an email, which is also a varchar, which can have no more than 255 characters, and also a very insecure password that will also be a varchar with a maximum of, you guessed it, 255 characters. Finally, we're going to say our primary key will be our ID. And so, if everything worked right, and it did. So now if we say show tables, we have a users table. And if we say show columns from users, we'll see that. But if we select everything from users, it's still an empty set. So let's fix that. Let's insert into users, and first we'll map the columns. We'll say the first column is ID, the second column is first name, the third column is last name, the fourth column is email, and the final column will be our password. So that's our users table columns. Next we want to map in the values. So the value for ID will be 1, the first name will be Jim, last name Beam, and then email will be jim.beam@sippingitdown.com. And then we'll add not a secure password as our password, partially to be responsible with that because it's not a secure password. You don't want anybody thinking it's a secure password when it's not. In local development it's probably okay, but you know, we're not doing any hashing on that. We will get to that. That's part of this series. That's not part of this lesson though, but we will get to that. So right now that is not a good password. it's actually technically illegal if you're trying to store anybody's personal information for any sort of company that they signed up for. So we will definitely be fixing that later in this tutorial. All right, so now we're going to say select blank from users, and we have a user. So what are the chances that we can get this user in our API controller? So what we want to do is we want to say the user equals db table users find one. Or better yet, we want to use, we'll get there. Okay, so to get that set up, and we're really close to being done on this one, we want to go over here to our database service provider. And what we want to do first is we want to get the options, which are going to be data get config database.connection. Config is going to be the database.default, just like that. So that's going to be our database options. And of course we need to spell it right. And so what we're saying is we want to get our config, and it's going to be database.connections, right? Which, if you remember, is going to be an array of different types of connections. But we want to get the specific connection based on whatever we've defined as our default. So we want to get this value, and then we want to get the connections array, and then ultimately we're going to connect to the database that this default value lines up within the keys for connections. So it's MySQL, we're going to get this guy. That was way too wordy. Okay, so we want to do basically MySQL. That's what it's going to be. We just need to dynamic get it, so it's a little wordier. And so all we did was we did data get database connections. Is that connection or connections? Connections. And then we just passed in the database default as the key. Database default MySQL, got that value. All right. So then we're going to say capsule is going to be the new DB. We're going to say capsule add connection. We're going to pass in our options. We're going to say capsule set as global. And finally, we're going to tell the capsule to boot Eloquent up. Oh man, that makes me so excited. Next, we will finally bind this DB class to a function that resolves an instance of that capsule. Honestly, guys, I have no idea why they call it capsule. Maybe because it's like multiple connections. They're able to connect to multiple things. You can add more than one connection if you want. But other than that, personally, I'm not a big fan of the name. That's why I added that alias. After that, we're going to go to HTTP controllers. Then we're going to use database again. And this is mainly why I set up the alias. Now we can do database DB, and we can do database table users find one. And we're going to say user equals that. And because we added the DB to our container within our service provider, this bind, remember, says this container set, because we're binding the DB class to an instance of capsule. Now within our API controller, we can reference the key, and this will automatically resolve from our database if it's able to be resolved. After that, we're simply going to say JSON decode, and let's just do user JSON pretty print. And then I think that should work. Hopefully, maybe. We'll see. And routes API, so that goes to API controller. So again, guys, remember in the route/API, we're going to API/example, not just example. We added our global HTTP kernels to set that stuff up. All right. Now let's see what we get. Oh, undefined index driver. Database manager, Illuminate Database, database manager, config driver. Really? I think driver is right there, is it not? Driver is MySQL. So let's do this. Let's do die and dump options. That way, when we reload our page, okay. Database.default. So we're messing up some sort of syntax somewhere. Where are we messing that up with? So it's going to be default to MySQL, right? So if we go to database service provider, database.default. So if we go back to database service provider, let's just dd the config database.default. What's that get? Null. Now why is that null? It's going to be database. That's why. There's a space right there. There we go. Yeah, sometimes it's just the small things, guys. I don't know. After that is set up, we'll die and dump the options. And then once the options are set up, we properly do have a driver now. So now let's do this. And voila, we properly connected to our database. So again, this is we set our options right here. It's getting our options from MySQL. Config database, our MySQL options. Our MySQL options reference our .env for the really important information like database password. Then we are using capsule, which if we go to our config app aliases, is really Illuminate Database Capsule Manager. And then we're just getting that capsule manager. We're adding a connection using our MySQL options. After that, we're setting the connection as global. We're booting up Eloquent and then binding that capsule to our container based on the alias DB class, just so we can inject it and it looks better than some sort of capsule manager thing that nobody's going to know what it's doing. It's like, is that my database? Yeah, that capsule manager, that's your database. So that's pretty cool stuff. There's one more thing I want to show you, which is actually amazing. We're going to add a model. We're going to add a user.php class, and we're going to say extend Eloquent model. Okay, so there's two types of variables within an Eloquent model. There are the fillable. These are publicly accessible. These are going to, by the way, both of these, protected fillable and protected guarded, both reference columns within our table. So fillable is going to be like first name, last name, email, and I think that's probably it. And then guarded is going to be our password. We don't want to accidentally pass our password to the front end. So guarded and fillable within Eloquent are probably two of the most amazing yet annoying features. But fillable is basically the stuff that we're able to kind of pass around, not really care who sees it, it's not going to harm anybody. Guarded is the properties on our record, on our model, that we need to guard. And obviously password is one of those. So it's harder to set, it's harder to save, it's harder to create, it's harder to see. But that's kind of the point, it's a password. So user extends an Eloquent model, and what does model do? Well, check this out. Even more than DB table users find one. Like, that's nice, right? So check this. Use app / user, and then we're actually just going to say user equals user find one. If we reload our page, that works. Get rid of this DB part right there. Still works. Nothing wrong with it. And then a lot of people do not like doing this because we're not using dependency injection, which means technically you're depending on extraneous state, gets really fancy, whatever. If you want to simply use a single instance of user, then you can do user find one, or you can do user find one, and they will still work just the same. We can also, here, let's just show that one off real quick. Now secured, there we go. So now we can remove the database right there, and we have access to database. The other thing we can do that is really cool with models, that's a little bit harder to do with database query builders, and there's two types of query builders we'll be working with, is when we have a view like this. And so then we do like app/user, and then we do user find one. Say user equals user find one. Put that up there. Then we pass through our user, right? Well, what's harder to do with the query builder, that's a lot easier to do when we get a model, when we query through our model. And let's do app/user. What's a lot harder to do is when we're actually in our templates on the other side of things. So if we go to resources, views, auth home.blade, and then we remove this example we use in our env, and we do like user name, and then we do like user email, etc., etc. We reload our page. Oop, we're on example, so let's go welcome/Sam. Homepage at Jim Beam. I'm sipping it down. So if we go right there, then we could of course access just about any property on our user. But if we also had, like, for example, roles on our user, we had relationships on our user, what's really cool is within our user, within our models, that's where we define all of our relationships between different things we represent within our code base. So we can do like public function teams, and then we can do this belongs to team class, or we could do this belongs to mini team class. And for those familiar with Laravel, this is like, you know it already. For those who are not, we will be getting into this in later lessons. But another really cool thing with this is we can do public function and then as ... and then we'll say roles. Maybe we'll just do acting as, and then we'll do roles equals roles. User acting as one of those roles. So back in home.blade, what we can do is we could do user acting as, and then we'll say admin, and then we'll do admin, super admin, you know, whatever it is. And then if the user is currently acting as an admin, we can do @if, I don't know why I added that extra array. So we can do @if user is acting as admin, then username, user email, user password, etc., etc. Not sure if that password will show up or not. And then we can do pre. And then we'll even go up here. Acting as admin. And then we'll do this. We'll go back to user. Sorry guys, I'm making this a little more complicated. We'll say roles equals an array of roles. And then we'll say acting as roles, this role. And this role is currently admin. So if this role is in the array of roles that we're checking to see if the user is, we'll return true, otherwise we'll return false. And because we're looking pretty good, we're saying if the user is acting as admin or super admin, let them see this name, this email, and this password. So if we reload that page, currently they are acting as super admin, and we are able to see Jim Beam at sippingitdown.com, not secure password. But of course, if we were to go back to our user model and we said this role is basic, and we reloaded the page, nothing. So we can add like really cool stuff when we have the user, and I recommend not overusing it, but when you have the user and you pass through the user instead of just like an array of data, like you have the model, the object, the representation of whatever that thing is itself, and you're able to pass that to your template, that's a hugely powerful thing. So yeah, guys, that's what I wanted to show you. I'm going to remove this for now. Next time, we're going to go through setting up database factories, database migrations, and database seeders. That will allow us to add dummy data to our database, to manipulate our tables and the structure of our tables without needing to directly interact through MySQL and do all that jazz. Seeders will allow us to add dummy data, and factories will allow us to create a dummy instance of a given model with dummy data. So seeders are for a table, dummy data for a table, factories are dummy data for an instance. Migrations are to set up the structure of our database and make sure that we have version control for our database like we do our code base. So guys, that's all I got for today. This is Zachary Hoare with Clean Code Studio. Clean code, clean life. Simplify. If you learned something new today, something cool, let me know. If you're still looking to learn something on this LIM stuff, I'm kind of slowly going through all this stuff, and if you have anything specific in mind, feel free to reach out in the comments. I can't guarantee you I'll be able to get to it, because there's just a lot of stuff to cover. But at the same time, there's been some stuff where it's like, oh, that'd be interesting to check out. So if you do have any ideas on what to cover, or you're really liking something, you're really not liking something, let me know, and I'll do my best to address it. So thanks again, guys. This is Zachary Hoare with Clean Code Studio. I'll see you guys next time for database migrations, seeders, and factories. Simple